The sitting is open. Dear colleagues, the first item of business this afternoon is a debate under urgent procedure on the draft framework convention on artificial intelligence, human rights, democracy, and the rule of law. It is documents 15971 and 15951, presented by Mrs. Suna Evansdottir on behalf of the Committee on Legal Affairs and Human Rights. I call Mrs. Evansdottir, Rapporteur, to take the floor. Dear Suna, you have 7 minutes now and 3 minutes at the end to reply to the debate.
Dear President, dear colleagues, the Committee of Ministers transmitted to the Assembly a draft framework convention on artificial intelligence, human rights, democracy, and the rule of law, which was prepared by the Committee on Artificial Intelligence on March 20th. We were invited to give our statutory opinion on the text as soon as possible, because it is no secret that the Committee of Ministers wishes to introduce this first internationally legally binding instrument on artificial intelligence, human rights, the rule of law, and democracy on the 75th anniversary of this important institution, the Council of Europe, at its ministerial meeting in May. This explains why we need to apply the urgent procedure to this here affair, although I have been quite vocal in stating that perhaps we didn't need to rush so much, despite the lovely occasion. As chair of the Subcommittee on Artificial Intelligence and Human Rights, in the years of 2022 and 2023, I followed very closely the drafting process of negotiations of this convention within the Committee on Artificial Intelligence, attending many of its plenary meetings and submitting drafting proposals and comments. This negotiation was not an easy process, and you may have read some of the criticisms voiced on the procedure, which are summarized in my explanatory memorandum. There were several non-member states, as well as the EU, who participated in the negotiations, and the final compromise, particularly on the scope of the application of the Convention, was only reached at the very, very last stages of the negotiations, leaving the observers largely outside of the discussion on the scope. Because most of the important decisions made by the Committee of Artificial Intelligence were made within the drafting group of negotiators, which was not open to civil society and not open to the Assembly as an observer. However, our role, the Assembly's role, in an opinion, is to express its position on the agreed text and to propose possible amendments to the Committee of Ministers. And this is what I've done with this opinion. The most problematic position and the most problematic provision of the treaty, in my view, is the scope of the application of the Convention, Article 3. It is offering a different approach when it comes to the public sector and the private sector, which is not in line with recommendations of this here Assembly. Each party, according to the treaty, will be able to determine how it intends to address the risks and impacts arising from the use of AI by private actors, either by applying the obligations set forth in the Convention or through other deemed appropriate measures. This is not ambitious enough for a Council of Europe convention, and it's not fully consistent with the position already expressed by the Assembly that the Convention should be addressed to all stakeholders. And I remind you, dear colleagues, that this is also what the CAHI, the previous or the predecessor to CAI, decided should be the scope of the Convention, that it should be transversal in nature. And therefore, it should include the private sector. I therefore propose to express in the Assembly's opinion our dissatisfaction with the compromise solution reached, and at the same time, that we call on all of our member states, when they ratify the Convention, that they accept the full applicability to the private sector in their Article 3 declarations. If other member states, other non-member states, but member states of the future Convention, want to do differently, this should not be an excuse for our states to water down their obligation in respect of the private sector and to depart from what should be our European common denominator or consensus. I've carefully considered the criticisms and proposals made by other observers and civil society throughout the process. Some of them have been specifically addressed to me and the Assembly during the past days and weeks. And I would like to thank civil society organizations, including the Conference of International NGOs of the Council of Europe, for their input and to recognize their very and exceptionally diligent work throughout the negotiations. The amendments I propose in the draft opinion are intended to strengthen the draft convention, taking due account of the framework nature and the underlying logic of the text. In total, I propose 11 amendments to the draft convention and would like to draw your attention to the most important ones. The first is on national security. We cannot and should not accept the blanket exemption on our national security from the scope of the Convention. This was certainly the result of a deal with the European Union, which has also excluded national security from the EU AI Act. But the EU and the Council of Europe are different organizations, and so not the same logic should apply. According to the European Convention on Human Rights, national security grounds can only justify limitations or restrictions on different individual rights, but cannot exclude completely national security purposes of AI from a convention which is precisely intended to protect human rights in the context of AI, particularly when it is used by the public administration. We have certain rules that apply when we want to limit the applicability of human rights protections. It has to be provided by law. It has to be proportional. It has to be necessary in a democratic society, and so on. Excluding it completely weakens the protection of our citizens, and we really should encourage the Committee of Ministers to reintroduce it. Furthermore, considering the risks of AI for military purposes, as we saw in our report last year on lethal autonomous weapons, I also propose to delete the blanket exemption on national defense from the scope of the Convention. I find it also extremely important that we refer to health and the environment. Although they appear in the preamble, they deserve a dedicated provision under general principles. I also think we should have a specific provision on whistleblowers and AI, in line with the Assembly's long-standing support for whistleblowers. And finally, we should have a specific provision on parliamentary involvement. These are constructive and realistic amendments that would improve significantly the text of the Framework Convention and that the Committee of Ministers should introduce. Some of them, in fact, appeared in previous versions of the draft convention and were unfortunately dropped through the negotiations, and I hope that you can all support them. Let me conclude by saying that our Assembly will remain vigilant on this issue, and we should be invited to participate in future conference of the parties set up by the Convention. We will have played our part by adopting this opinion, and we expect and demand that the Committee of Ministers take these proposals seriously. After the adoption of a hopefully modified text, we as parliamentarians should, of course, support the ratification of the treaty by our national parliaments, recognizing the full applicability of its obligations to private actors. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Madam Evansdottir. Dear colleagues, in the debate, I will call first the speakers on behalf of political groups, starting with Monsieur Damien Gauthier from ALDE.
Merci. Thank you very much, President. Artificial intelligence is a revolution that is going to affect all our societies, our economies, and our societies, and our politics too. And it needs an institutional framework. And it was therefore important for the Council of Europe to be active in this field, because it's like discovering a new continent almost. And there are all kinds of things that are going to emerge, new opportunities are going to emerge from this artificial intelligence, no doubt for the better, but also for the worse. And we need to get ready for exploring this new continent on our planet. And we can be proud of the fact that it is the Council of Europe that is offering the first international framework convention, the first legally binding international instrument on this topic. It's important for the scope of this convention to be beyond the borders of the European continent, because this text will be open to signature by other countries which are not members of the Council of Europe. And therefore, the Convention will be able to have a broad international impact and almost global impact. It will provide a legal framework for this new technology, for this new area, this new sector, this new, as I've said, continent, which we see opening up before us. This is an excellent framework, this new convention, which will then need to be added to and used by our states, our member states. And it's important to underline, as the rapporteur has said, that there are some gaps in this convention. Sometimes the lowest common denominator, and sometimes it's not quite the protection of fundamental freedoms and democracy that we need, especially when it comes to national security and the role of private companies. We must recall that for all member states, the Convention still applies, the European Convention on Human Rights, and it applies to cyberspace as well, and to artificial intelligence already, AI already. We are talking about national jurisdictions that are already submitted to the subject to the provisions of that Council Convention. We also need to take into account countries which may join, which are not members of the Council. President, we also need to make sure that we are not naive given the major potential risks, and this is something that the Convention seeks to address, but it's also important that we don't prevent innovation. We mustn't over-regulate. We don't want to prohibit matters in advance or put barriers up. We must take account of risks, and we must provide a framework for them. We must let technology develop for the better, as I've said, and what will be important will be to protect human rights, but also democracy. We must be clear about the risks, potential risks of these new technologies, and especially when it comes to the organisation of free elections. And that is a matter we're going to have to pay particular attention to. On behalf of the ALDE Group, I would like to thank the rapporteur, who is also a chair of the Commission, which I will now be taking over, and we need to continue to be attentive to this matter and continue to follow it. Thank you.
Merci, Damien. Next, Frédéric Mathieu from United European Left.
Thank you very much, President. Before I start, on behalf of my group, I would like to thank the rapporteur most warmly for the work that she has done on this file. Thank you for being so exacting, so precise, so thorough in your introductory statement to this debate as well. Thank you, Madam. President, dear colleagues, artificial intelligence, the use thereof, is subject to much debate in our societies, and generally we tend to raise new fears, for instance, human intelligence being replaced by machines, fake images, fake publications, job losses. However, we should recall that artificial intelligence is just a tool. I think there's an image I could use in order to explain why we should not be afraid of artificial intelligence per se, but rather afraid of the way it might be used. You know, the problem will never come from a hammer, say, it will come from the hand that holds that hammer. That's my illustration. The draft Framework Convention is certainly a major step forward to regulate the use of artificial intelligence. But like the rapporteur, I also regret the fact that the use by private actors of artificial intelligence is less regulated than the use made by public actors. There is a disparity here, and it could actually create a danger. Private actors, who are often more advanced than public actors when it comes to new technologies, may use artificial intelligence with methods or with purposes that are actually flouting human rights and the rule of law. For instance, what would we say if a company were to decide to harness a great amount of personal data in order to maybe glean information from social networks and then prepare a campaign for disinformation, propaganda, particularly in the context of an election or a parliamentary debate? We know that the push by some countries to get their narrative across can be dangerous for our democracies. It has consequences, so we can't be naive. There are big companies, private companies, that could actually subvert artificial intelligence. Notwithstanding, the rapporteur has looked into all this and developed it at length in her report, for which we commend her, and we very much welcome the steps being taken to regulate the use of artificial intelligence. We therefore call upon the House to vote in favour of the report. Thank you.
Next is Petra Bayer on behalf of the Socialists, Democrats and Greens.
Thank you very much. One of the proposals that Sona had made in the draft opinion is to add a specific article in the Convention on Parliamentary Involvement, and I couldn't agree more on that. Stating that national parliaments should participate in the review of the implementation measures at national level, and that the Assembly should regularly take stock on the implementation of the Convention, a provision that already exists in the Istanbul Convention. National parliaments are particularly well placed to understand the risks that AI poses to democracy, but also the potential benefits for democracy, participation and governance. We should play our role and contribute to this debate more actively, I think. And let me also add some general thoughts about democracy and AI. We had a side event of Women at Pace on Tuesday, where we also had a focus on democracy and AI. And I can tell you that I value very positively the Article 5 of the draft Framework Convention, which imposes an obligation on future parties to adopt or maintain measures to seek to ensure that AI systems are not used to undermine the integrity, independence, and effectiveness of democratic institutions and processes, including the principle of separation of powers, respect for juridical independence, and access to justice. Each party shall also adopt or maintain measures that seek to protect its democratic process in the context of AI, including individuals' fair access to and participation in public debate, as well as their ability to freely form opinions. This provision should, of course, be read and applied in the light of the Council of Europe consolidated principles on democracy and the rule of law, as well as fundamental freedoms guaranteed by the Convention, such as freedom of expression, freedom of association, and the right to free elections. Although there is no abstract definition of democratic institutions and processes in the Convention or in the explanatory report, the explanatory report clearly states that the reference is being made to all systems of governance with certain basic features and institutions which are common to all democratic countries. That means that this convention, which is of course open also to non-member states to ratify, can only be ratified by democratic states. Some examples given of democratic institutions and processes that may be threatened by AI are separation of powers, system of checks and balances between the three branches of governance, political pluralism, and existence of pluralistic and independent media, participation in democratic processes through free and fair elections, and particularly of forms of meaningful civil and political participation, respect the rights of minorities, etc. So we should not forget the Reykjavik principles for democracy, which were approved last year, and I think that rounds up our debate on that. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Elisabetta Jasko on behalf of the EPP.
Dear colleagues, it's incredible but also shocking that, in fact, this convention is the first ever international treaty on artificial intelligence. And on behalf of EPP Group, of course, I want to congratulate all of us to finally having this convention, to having this report, because it seems quite crazy that we have so much of the influence of artificial intelligence on our democracies, but it's the only time we finally have some regulations on that. As mentioned by the colleagues, this convention has some gaps and a lot of big threats. And one of them is not understanding of how this convention could help us on regulating and restricting disinformation, and how the private companies that unfortunately can take their own interests and put all of us under the influence of them, how what would be the answer, how it will all be regulated. But I call upon all of us here to make sure that in the next discussions we have more solutions on how can we make it happen. Artificial intelligence definitely has a lot of benefits and advantages for democracies. And let's only imagine how artificial intelligence can, if it's well regulated, can help in demining efforts, in helping our environment. There is so much to be done, but let's make sure that these tools of artificial intelligence are not in the wrong hands. This is very important. We all suffer a lot from this. And one thing that I also want to mention is the gap that could be a big concern is it's not clear how people with disabilities, how their rights would be protected by this convention, because artificial intelligence cannot be accessible to all, unfortunately. It's not clear now with this convention, and we could work more on this. Let me one more time congratulate the rapporteur, and that we finally have this convention that should have happened much earlier.
Next speaker, Christophe Lacroix.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you very much, President. Thank you for calling me to speak in this very important debate. I would like to first and foremost congratulate Suna. In record time, you have produced admirable work. It's magnificent. The question really is, what are we there for? We as politicians, are we going to let machines, technology, opaque systems, are we going to let them decide instead of us, decide for our citizens, men and women in our societies? No, we should be regulating artificial intelligence. Of course, artificial intelligence is a source of progress. It's quite incredible, provided that, of course, AI is premised upon our democratic values, our values of transparency, and also our values of explanation. We know, of course, that AI used by manipulative forces, by the wrong hands, we know that that has led to mass manipulation of populations, targeting people who are particularly vulnerable, pitting them against one another, making them believe that their children are under threat, making them believe that refugees or immigrants were going to invade our societies en masse to replace us as a society. We know that. And that has led to certain campaigns. For instance, in the UK, the Brexit vote, there was an influence. It's been proven. Also, Russian interference in European elections, USA elections. Therefore, this framework convention should be there to better regulate this. And like Suna, I too deplore the fact that the private sector is given an easy ride, comparatively speaking. The Framework Convention does not sufficiently emphasize how important it is to regulate also the system and the power that lies in private hands. It's a pity. Now, allow me to finish on the national defense point. Suna flagged this, quite rightly. Autonomous lethal weapons that could be used without any kind of human being steering them. Now, this is not science fiction. It's not fiction. It's something that's being used by Iran, being used by opaque regimes, terrorist, dictatorial regimes. Indeed, worse than that, we have allegations, and these are serious allegations. Even Sahal, the Israeli army, may have used artificial intelligence in order to target select individuals and to bomb territories in Gaza. And that, of course, has led to uncounted destruction and devastation. Therefore, it's high time for us to take matters in hand. Let us not be naive. Let us be vigilant. Let us be there to safeguard democracy. And let us make sure, and this is something that we really have to say loud and clear, we will never yield. We have our responsibilities. We will always stand by these responsibilities, respecting freedom, dignity, human life. These are red lines for us. We will not negotiate on them. Thank you.
And now I would like to call Mr. Vardanyan. Mr. Vardanyan, you have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. You know, artificial intelligence has drastically changed our world. And frankly speaking, some 20, 30 years ago, we would dream of having artificial intelligence as a tool for solving this or that problem. Today, in a couple of seconds, may somehow create a picture of our assembly, and this is an asset of the artificial intelligence. But it's brought with it a lot of shortcomings and challenges. And this attempt is to provide rather humanistic, moral values to the artificial intelligence, to try to create AI with the necessary human features, which would allow all of us in the future to be assured that artificial intelligence tools would be served for the good things and for the development of humanity. For sure, such kind of important instrument cannot and shouldn't be adopted in a hurry. On this perspective, I absolutely agree with the reporter. We should think twice before we are going ahead with such a sensitive and very important issue. I cannot
Justice instruction in January to Israel to take all possible measures to prevent genocidal acts as outlined in Article 2 of the 1948 Genocide Convention. It is unbelievable that this Human Rights Assembly had originally planned not to include the issue of Gaza this week. Yesterday, this Assembly called for the seizure of Russian assets to rebuild Ukraine. Who here will be calling for the seizure of Israeli assets to rebuild Gaza? Any takers? Apparently some occupations are absolutely fine with this Assembly. I find the double standards here incredible. We are all witnesses to the ongoing genocide in Gaza. We've had a week dominated by the issue of one illegal occupation, but the same people grandstanding on Ukraine have nothing to say about a genocide literally taking place as we speak within another illegal occupation. And what I find most shocking is that 6 months into this unfolding horror, the Secretary General of this institution still has nothing to say about the genocide taking place, even as children are dying by imposed starvation. It is not just the apartheid state of Israel that must be held to account. Those countries that continue to supply the military hardware that allows Israel to keep the slaughter of Palestinian women and children going, the US, Germany, and Britain in particular, must also answer for their actions. Nobody is fooled by expressions of concern by their leaders, even as they continue to stoke the IDF war machine with fresh arms sales. The fact that Germany will now be tried at the International Court of Justice to establish if once again it has become involved in genocide is truly a mark of shame. We must respond to the war crimes being committed in Gaza. We need an immediate ceasefire. We need an immediate arms embargo against Israel, the ending of the EU-Israel trade agreement. We need real European pressure to end the slaughter. My message on behalf of the United European Left is ceasefire now and justice for the people of Palestine.
Frank Zwabe on behalf of the Socialists, the Democrats and Greens.
Herr Präsident,
President, thank you very much indeed. At this time, the Middle East is on the brink of a regional war which would have massive repercussions throughout the world. At a time we're already dealing with the Russian war of aggression against Ukraine. It is no coincidence that the country responsible for all of this is the country which is guilty of brutal domestic repression. It is threatening Israel. It is the same country which supplies weapons to Russia to terrorize people in Ukraine. Iran also is the country which supplied Hamas with the wherewithal to commit the worst conceivable atrocities against people in Israel, and we condemn the current attack by Iran in the strongest possible terms. But once again, current events are pushing the people in Gaza and their terrible plight into the background. But we will take a stand. We have a conflict which has been dragging on for so many years and remains unresolved, and we're now paying the price for that. This is a conflict in which Israel is surrounded by countries which to erase it from the map, and in which Palestinians are striving for a free and independent and life to be lived in equality, which they are denied. All of this culminated in the terrible attack by Hamas on Israel. This is the background to Israel's attack on the Gaza Strip. But I have spoken to humanitarian relief workers who tell me the situation in Gaza is the worst they have ever witnessed, and I would like to thank them for their untiring support from the bottom of my heart. Now, there are 300,000 dead. People talk about a genocide have to be careful because we've already witnessed genocides in our history, and we shouldn't play fast and loose with that term and in any way undermine it. We have about 6,000 mothers who have been killed, about 19,000 children who've been left orphans. We're talking about a category IPC 5 starvation event. There are all kinds of examples that I could rehearse, and it goes without saying that Hamas ultimately is responsible for this disaster. And at the same time, Israel cannot wage war in this way. It is leaving the civilian population defenseless, and it is inexplicably refusing to let in humanitarian aid. People are having to wait far too long at checkpoints, and the drink water supply is non-existent, rejecting aid deliveries. We are seeing an escalation of violence by Israeli settlers in the West Bank, and ministers in the government leave us in no doubt that they want to reoccupy the Gaza Strip. But it is our job to strive to bring about an immediate improvement in the humanitarian situation. We should be calling for a ceasefire and also for the release of hostages, and it is now time for a two-state solution. This is probably the most thorny issue we have to wrestle with, but there is no alternative. Anything else leads inexorably to the next disaster.
Danke, Herr Vorsitzender. Ich werde Deutsch benutzen, weil das ist eine...
Thank you very much indeed, President. I will be speaking German because it is one of the languages that I master. But I would like to say that everything Frank Schwaber has had to say is, well, I concur with his views. The two-state solution. The Oslo Accords have failed to come about, but they remain the Oslo Accords. Nor should we forget that the attack targeted not settlements, but Israeli territory on the 7th of October. And there was meticulous planning in the run-up to that attack. Hamas working closely with Iran and Hezbollah. Any compassion that we express must include the Palestinians. We must ensure that the Palestinian people are given assistance. But in 2007, Prime Minister Sharon removed the settlements from Gaza, and these settlements were then rebuilt on the Israeli side. They were, for the most part, freedom-loving people living in the kibbutz, as I say, not settlements, but rather Israeli territory. So I think we need to help the Palestinians rebuild the Gaza Strip. But I'd like to stress that the Iranian side, with the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, and here the European Parliament, we're sitting in the chamber, the European Parliament has said on a number of occasions that they are a terrorist group, a terrorist organization. Now, the embassy that was bombed by Israel in Damascus was not an Iranian embassy, but rather headquarters used by the Iranian Revolutionary Guard. And the IRG was in contact with Hamas and Hezbollah. So it was no ordinary embassy. That being said, we must do all in our power to assist the Palestinian people. But we need to respect Israel's right to defend itself, and Iran has to be uncoupled from its proxies in the wider Middle East, so that Iran can no longer exert its influence on political reality in the region, because Iran, of course, is fomenting the war. It's involved in Ukraine. It's part of an axis working together with Moscow and with other countries that are against our democratic way of life and spreading propaganda.
Danke.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, dear Emanuelis. On behalf of the European Conservatives, Elisabetta Gardini.
Grazie, Presidente.
Thank you very much, President. Colleagues. More than 6 months on from the terrorist attack of the 7th of October, the humanitarian crisis in Gaza is extremely serious and complex. In order to deal with the dramatic situation confronting Palestinian civilians, the international community has mobilized, deploying a huge means and resources. Italy, just to take one example, since the 7th of October, has spent some 20 million euros, has launched the initiative Food for Gaza, has spent a hospital ship, Vulcano, and Palestinian children are cared for in our main pediatric hospitals. And at international level, very soon, the Maritime Aid to Gaza operation will be launched, providing for the opening of a maritime corridor. And Israel, too, I think that's to be acknowledged, is doing its bit. The Heretz crossing point has been reopened, destroyed by Hamas on the 7th of October. And the 16th of April, this week, some 376 lorries with humanitarian aid entered Gaza, 105 of them via Jordan. And that same day, 98 pallets with some tens of thousands of meals were airlifted and dropped in northern Gaza. But I think we need to be careful, because there's a lot of disinformation circulating, fake news that's deliberately being disseminated with a view to covering up the truth or the reality. We shouldn't forget, as our colleague Zingaris has said, and other colleagues too, that everything started with a savage terrorist attack of the 7th of October. And that's why I here would like to repeat my firm condemnation of the brutal aggression perpetrated by Hamas. And I'd also repeat the call for the immediate release of the 133 Israeli hostages still held in Gaza that nobody has been able to visit, neither the Red Cross nor any NGO nor a doctor. The reticence that these calls meet are a disguised form of anti-Semitism that's no longer admissible. Of course, the legitimate right of Israel to defend itself must be proportionate and abide by international humanitarian law. But Israel has now been attacked by Iran, that seeks to destabilize the region and destroy Israel, drawing on its proxies in the region, namely Hamas, as well as the Islamic Jihad and the Houthi. Following the Iranian attack, Giorgia Meloni, the Italian premier, in her capacity as chair of the G7, convened a video conference at the level of heads of state and government, adopting a declaration, a joint declaration, condemning the situation, calling for support for Israel's security, and expressing concern over further destabilization of the region and further escalation. I think the international situation is certainly complex, and the crisis in Gaza in the forefront of our minds. We need a ceasefire, a guarantee for humanitarian corridors, and we need to ensure that the hostages are released. Thank you.
Claude Kern.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, President, colleagues. In the wake of the barbarous terrorist attack of the 7th of October and actions by the Houthis and Hezbollah, the State of Israel last week came under massive attack by drones, cruise missiles and ballistic missiles which have been launched directly from Iran, which I strongly condemn. But the Israeli defense system worked very well and allowed them to destroy virtually all of the missiles and drones, although should also stress that many neighboring states and allies, including France, as an actor in regional security, since it has bases in several states in the region, helped to destroy many of those missiles. But deciding to take such a course of action means that Iran, which has been advocating the destruction of Israel for 40 years, has moved into a new stage of its acts of destabilization as a risk of military escalation. I would call for restraint and for peace. And also, we need to look at people across the Middle East who suffer the consequences of the terrorist acts which are spearheaded by Iran or its affiliates. We, of course, set great store by Israel's security, which is under threat from all sides, as well as regional stability. And I do worry about the border with Lebanon. I'm delighted that the European Council decided to take new restrictive measures against Iran, particularly those targeted at drones and missiles. These measures might also serve Ukraine's cause because Russia itself has extensive recourse to the Shahed drones which are produced by Iran. But here in the Council of Europe, once again, I would like to appeal once again for the freeing of the 134 hostages who are still being held by Hamas in the Gaza Strip, including 4 people who were kidnapped before the 7th of October. They have never received a visit from the Red Cross or from other humanitarian associations. At least 36 have been killed, and Hamas still has their bodies in Gaza. And this is why this has to stop. And military pressure on Hamas, of course, is vital to secure the release of the hostages and the return of the bodies of the dead. And of course our heart bleeds when we see the images of destruction and suffering in Gaza. But if Hamas really wants a ceasefire, then it must immediately release all those who are kidnapped and being held in Gaza. It is an inescapable prerequisite for negotiations with a view to a ceasefire. And that is why I have tabled a written declaration that many of us have signed. And I hope that this plea for peace and responsibility is heard outside this chamber. Thank you.
We will now hear a pre-recorded speech from the head of the Israeli delegation, Meirav Ben-Ari.
Honorable members of the Parliamentary Assembly, I would like to apologize for not being able to attend this important meeting in person. I would like to open by relating to the attack committed by the Islamic Republic of Iran and its proxies against Israel on April 14. Since the October 7th Hamas massacre, Israel has been fighting Iranian proxies throughout the region. With Iran's direct attack against Israel earlier this week, Iran has emerged behind the shadow and has confirmed its identity as a terrorist state. The excellent cooperation between Israel, the United States, and other allies played an important role in containing the attack, and we appreciate our partners for supporting Israel's right to defend itself. And now for the situation in Gaza. Firstly, I must emphasize our continuing demand for the release of 133 hostages held by Hamas, without access or intervention from the International Committee of the Red Cross. Despite persistent efforts over the past few weeks, Hamas has rejected every initiative from the mediators to reach a deal. Israel has agreed to significant concessions in the fighting, including the return of residents to their homes. But it seems that Hamas is not interested in a deal or in ending the war. Israel, with its battle against Hamas, remains determined in its dedication to minimizing civilian harm. Israel has been allowing humanitarian aid, including food and medicine, into Gaza for a very long time. We are working in full cooperation with all the relevant countries in the region. Regarding recent unfortunate incidents, Israel expresses deep regard of the tragic loss of life involving members of a World Central Kitchen team. We have conducted through investigation resulting in disciplinary action against the responsible parties. Our collaboration with international organizations like WCK remains crucial, and we prioritize the safety of aid workers. Contrary to misleading claims, Israel imposes no limit on vital supplies entering Gaza. Since the start of the war, more than 20,780 tons of medical supplies have entered the Gaza Strip in order to support the medical response for Gaza's civilians. The supplies are distributed to various hospitals and clinics, including in the northern Gaza Strip. In coordination with Egypt, the United Arab Emirates, and Turkey, those in Gaza that are ill and wounded exit the Gaza Strip for treatment. So far, 3,204 people, along with 725 escorts, have exited the Gaza Strip for treatment in Egypt, the UAE, Turkey, Qatar, and Jordan. Israel does everything in its power to prevent harm to civilians. It allows residents of the Gaza Strip to receive assistance and support from international organizations. However, unfortunately, our hostages do not receive any assistance from any party. Their families are losing hope day after day. No nation will tolerate a situation in which its citizens are held by a murderous terrorist organization without any assistance or support for international rescue organization. Thank you for your attention and consideration. Bring our people back home now. Thank you.
Next speaker is Bernard Sabella from the Palestinian delegation, who is joining via a video link. Mr. Sabella, you have the floor.
Action Against Hunger, issued on the 9th of April, that reaffirms an immediate permanent ceasefire. The conflict in Gaza has led to over 1 million people facing catastrophic levels of food insecurity. 81% of households lack access to safe and clean water. And in northern Gaza, people go entire days without eating. Famine is preventable if there is an immediate cessation of hostilities and an immediate and permanent ceasefire. The extent of suffering by our people in the Gaza Strip is documented by UN OCHA, whose website details the numbers of families and individuals affected. the displacement of 1.8 million people, the killing of 33,000 individuals, mostly women, children, and the orphaning of some 19,000 children whose mothers, 6,000 of them, were killed during the war. One can go on talking about the disastrous situation. Humanitarian aid workers, some 196, have lost their lives. 97 journalists and media workers were killed, injured, or went missing. Relief Web, in a post of April 8, reported that the Israeli army has targeted almost every hospital in the Gaza Strip, leaving none fully functional. As a result, 484 healthcare workers have been killed. Also in the West Bank, settlers have attacked at least 17 villages and communities throughout Ramallah, Nablus, and Jerusalem. 20 Palestinian homes were set on fire. Several agricultural structures damaged, and 50 heads of livestock were killed, while 120 sheep went missing and probably taken away by settlers. Since October 7th, stringent measures have been applied by Israel in the West Bank that resulted in dire economic situation and contributed to further poverty and family deprivation. Any loss of life or limb is to be mourned, regardless of national, religious, or other characteristics. We need to realize that whole families have either been killed or dramatically affected by the loss, injury, or cease of their members across the dividing line in Israel and Palestine since October 7th. A friend of mine recently showed me a photo of a happy young Gaza girl wearing a beautiful dress in anticipation of a school event. He lamented the fact that she and her entire family had perished. Gaza lives, like other lives anywhere, are worth living. When we mourn selectively the victims of one side and turn a blind eye to the tens of thousands of innocent victims of the other, a problem of double standards is indeed with us and with you as well. Every life is a world of its own. Nothing should differentiate the applicability of our compassion to all victims of this ongoing troubling conflict in our land. Aside from humanitarian aid that individual states or the EU and the Council of Europe have already offered and continue to offer, there is an urgent need for an immediate ceasefire. Certainly, negotiating an immediate ceasefire would include the mutual release of Israeli hostages and Palestinian prisoners and the end of war. Conditions on the ground, nonetheless, point to the urgency of finding an immediate way out, a political exit that would guarantee to enable the Gaza population to heal itself and deal with its varied wounds. This cannot happen if there is a continuation of war or plans by Israel to go on with the war and the occupation of the Gaza Strip in the foreseeable future. And also, many have warned that if an attack on Rafah takes place, then more and more disasters and catastrophes are going to befall the Gaza population. Let me refer to an article by the American Foreign Policy of April 15, just this past Monday. that called for a comprehensive and results-based strategy that prioritizes assistance and contributes to a safe environmental inside Gaza to enable aid delivery. Certainly, and Europe and the Council could be part of this if it takes place. Let me quote verbatim what the Foreign Affairs article said. In particular, international actors should push to give the Palestinian Authority a key role in the aid effort and pressure Israel to allow meaningful PA involvement. Giving the PA a leading role in relief operations would help accomplish several goals at once. It would bring greater efficiency to aid delivery by leveraging the presence of the PA already has in Gaza. It would strengthen the new PA government and support the West Bank's economy. It would fill in the gaps between the grave immediate crisis in Gaza and the ultimate vision of a two-state solution by recognizing Gaza with the West Bank in a tangible way. I remain convinced, as majority of Palestinians, of the two-state solution. Continuing to manage the conflict, as Israel has done since its occupation of the Palestinian territory, would only invite further trouble down the road. Entrenching the presence of Israeli armed forces in the Gaza Strip for the foreseeable future would only invite further trouble, instability, and the wasting of opportunities for a possible peaceful solution based on the two-state option. Finally, the immediate urgency is to end the humanitarian catastrophe, but the urgency in the medium and long term remains that of working out the details and specifics of the two-state solution. Europe and your esteemed Council, with its Parliamentary Assembly, have an essential role and obligation to play its role in both these urgencies. Thank you, Mr. President, and the honorable members of PACE.
I want to thank both participants who joined via video link. Dear colleagues, I have on my hand a list of more than 30 colleagues who are registered. I intend to give the floor to all of them. So I would like to ask all of you to keep the time limit. It is the way that all speakers being registered will take the floor. We start with Samuel Niklaus Gugger.
Sehr geehrter Herr Präsident.
President, thank you very much to Mr. Sabella and to Ms. Ben Ari for sharing their views with us. I can be brief because I think that the group spokespeople have already made the most important points. What is important is that Israel realize the needs of the civilian population in Gaza, and as we have heard, we know that Israel is allowing the inflow of aid and medicines, and just last week it allowed aid in over the Erez border crossing as well as the Israeli port of Ashdod. But at the same time, we all know that Iran is deliberately destabilizing the region. We continue to call for the release of the 130 hostages still being held in Gaza. They have never been visited by the ICRC. That is still pending, and to date, Hamas has rejected all attempts to reach agreement on the release of those hostages. It has scorned any such attempts. And I think, ladies and gentlemen, this is where it all begins. If a married couple get into an argument, then both parties are involved, and once again, both parties need to come to the table to secure the release of hostages, and we must do everything in our power to make a restoration of peace a reality.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you very much. 160 years ago, 1864, Henri Dumont took to the baptismal font the First Geneva Convention with a view to introducing a bit of humanity into the war. 160 years on, these principles should still hold true and should serve to inspire us. And sort of Article 1 of the current Geneva Convention, 49 of universal scope, calls on all countries around the planet to apply and ensure that the principles of the Geneva Convention are applied. International humanitarian law, we all have obligations, our countries have obligations in order to ensure that these Geneva Conventions are applied under the current circumstances. Now, the unacceptable situation of the 133 hostages that are still being detained several months after the attacks, and as many have said, have not been visited by the International Committee of the Red Cross. That is unacceptable and a clear violation of the Geneva Conventions. The situation in Gaza, with the Israeli intervention and the dimension it has taken in terms of the impact on civil society, the weakest in society, children, the elderly, the handicapped, that action has taken proportions that are unacceptable and not what international humanitarian law can consider as legitimate, i.e. ensuring that Hamas is unable in the future to generate situations such as that which occurred on the 7th of October. Unspeakable terrorist act, but I think the scale of the operation in Gaza forces us to call on Israel to ensure better protection of the civil society. And Iran, that has further fueled tension in the region with its unacceptable drone attacks, probably targeting civil society also. All these things, ladies and gentlemen, these three dimensions or areas are a violation of the Geneva Conventions, a violation of international law, sort of a violation of humanitarian law, or a violation in terms of good sense, common decency in sense, because nobody has an interest in escalation in the Middle East. And I think we all need to be alarmed when we hear the Secretary General of the United Nations today saying that the region is on the brink of a precipice. So we need to turn to a sense of reason, release hostages, ensure more targeted operation, arrival of humanitarian aid in the Gaza Strip, and the cessation of attacks such as that launched by Iran. That is everything that the recent resolution adopted by the Security Council of the United Nations has called for, and yet, however far it might appear the two-state solution, it is more necessary than ever.
Signor Presidente.
President, now, on the 6th of March, along with a delegation of colleagues from the Italian Parliament, I travelled to Rafah. And beforehand, we were in Cairo meeting various NGOs, as well as UNRWA, which is the leading humanitarian organization. What did we see for ourselves? It's not fake news. We saw lorries held up and news that has reached us that deliveries have resumed. I mean, this has all been heralded as a big piece of news. 150 have been let in, apparently, but prior to the war, there were about 400 lorries going in, but only a few dozen have been going in for a stretch of many weeks now. So they are held up because their cargoes are suspected. of being dual use. So you've got field tents, ambulance, oxygen and compressors, and then of course you've got suites for children. You've got all kinds of items, not just those required for first aid. Now, of course, we condemn Hamas for its atrocities, and pressure has to continue to be applied on them to release the hostages, but none of that means that we can avert our gaze from what is happening right now. So what do the NGOs and the international organizations which are active in the field tell us? Those who care for children in the hospitals in Cairo, they tell us that what is unfolding right now in Gaza is far worse than we realize, because there is a visible side to these atrocities. You've got the military side of things, and then you've got the other side, which is a result of starvation and a lack of healthcare and treatment, because people are now suffering from chronic illnesses because the health system has completely collapsed. So, of course, you can talk about the legal ins and outs of the situation, or you can talk about the future prospects for this part of the world. But in doing so, we all need to realize that we need to bring about an initiative to bring about an immediate ceasefire, because those who are suffering under a hail of bombs can become a danger in themselves. So, how can we sit here talking about human rights if we're not even willing to try and put together an initiative in this organization to ratchet up the international pressure to bring about a ceasefire and make sure that there is a proper flow of humanitarian relief to the Gaza Strip?
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. President. A humanitarian catastrophe is underway in the Gaza Strip. This makes the debate launched on this subject at the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe extremely important and urgent. The bombing in Gaza has already killed more than 30,000 people, 70% of whom are women and children. More than 70,000 are injured. More than 1,000 children have lost a leg or an arm. The airstrikes on Gaza have led to a complete collapse of healthcare, with most residential buildings and schools demolished. Today, the greatest threat to the lives of the men and women of Gaza is hunger. But the Israeli government not only refuses to cooperate with humanitarian organizations, but it happens that actively attacks them. A Polish volunteer, Damian Sobul, was recently killed in one such attack. The second biggest threat is the planned attack on Rafah, that is currently home to 1.5 million refugees from the northern, completely destroyed part of the Palestinian territory. The bombing of Rafah will mean the death of hundreds of thousands of people, an atrocity on a scale that is hard to imagine. The Israeli government is ignoring both UN resolutions and the decision of the International Court of Justice. In January this year, the ICJ ordered Israel to stop killing civilians and to allow humanitarian aid into Gaza. None of this has happened. Actions of the Israeli government, contrary to the international law, some of which may be even treated as war crimes, must be met with a clear response from European states. Yes, I remember that this conflict was caused by Hamas. I condemn, like the entire civilized world, this brutal attack, murders and kidnappings. We were united with millions of Israelis in our feelings and anger towards the perpetrators of these atrocities. Yes, Israel has the right to defend itself and to respond appropriately. But this response, which we have been seeing for several months, is disproportionate and unacceptable. Saying that, I want to strongly emphasize that the criticism towards the Israeli government has nothing to do with anti-Semitism. If Europe wants to be credible in this call for peace, in its call for respect for human rights and the self-determination of peoples, it must take decisive steps to stop the massacre in Gaza. Dear colleagues, the speech I have just delivered was prepared by Mrs. Magdalena Biejat, my colleague from the Polish delegation, who unfortunately had to suddenly
Thank you, Mr. Borowski.
I'm finished. Return home. However, she asked me to speak on her behalf, which I did. I agreed because, although we belong to different political groups, I completely share the views expressed in this text. Thank you.
Alp Kornuk-Kocek.
Thank you, Mr. President. Dear colleagues, it's been more than 6 months. Almost 34,000 civilians, including international aid workers and journalists, have been killed. Almost 2 million people have been forcibly displaced, and civilian homes and structures, such as hospitals and schools, are deliberately targeted and destroyed. If we are sincerely willing to respond to the humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza, we must first agree on this: supporting Palestinians, protecting their rights, or defending the establishment of an independent Palestinian state does not make us anti-Semitic. We can support the rights of the Palestinians and criticize the policies of the Netanyahu government at the same time. Even the Israeli people are heavily, increasingly criticizing and protesting the Netanyahu government themselves. Yet, the international community is failing to take the necessary steps. This institution, however, our August Assembly, is the frontrunner of defending human rights in Europe and beyond. Therefore, it is our obligation to speak out against Israel's horrible, terrible actions, which are likely to constitute the crime of genocide according to the International Court of Justice. Human rights, as its name suggests, must be enjoyed by every single human being, regardless of race, religion, or language. We must do something to end this humanitarian catastrophe before it is too late for those who were lucky enough to survive until now. We should also raise our voices against those European governments which are still supplying heavy weapons to Israel. As a sign of support to the people in Gaza, arms exports to Israel should be suspended until this crazy war is over. We should admit that there is a risk of spillover. Israel's attack on the Iranian embassy in Syria and Iran's retaliation have demonstrated that events could easily and quickly escalate into a regional war. Instability in the region has the potential to trigger greater global conflicts as well. Therefore, dear colleagues, you should urge your governments to halt sending more weapons to Israel. We should keep in mind that providing more weapons right now means that more civilians will be killed and the humanitarian situation in Gaza will be worsened. We should not let this happen. Thank you.
Andrew Pearce is next.
Thank you, Mr. President. As a new member, this is my first time speaking in this place, and it's a privilege to do so in this debate. I'm only sorry that the title of this debate does not include a reference to the hostages, so I will spend a couple of moments of my time referring to the hostage situation and say, first of all, there is absolutely no equivalence between hostages who were taken and stolen from their homes on October the 7th against their will, some of them as young as 9 months old, and prisoners who have been held in Israeli prisons because they have committed crimes and committed murder and violence. There is no equivalence. So when I speak today, I will think of hostages such as Irma Shem Tov, 21 years old, whose mother I met along with some colleagues here on an LNet delegation less than a month after the attacks of October the 7th. I'll think of the Bibas family, one of whom was as young as 9 months old. I'll think of Egan Berger, a 19-year-old. We know these hostages have been subjected to rape, they've been subjected to violence and abuse. And that is why I said in the House of Commons only a few weeks ago that nobody has any agency or any business in telling the state of Israel where it is able to operate to free hostages who have been subjected to that appalling treatment. Nobody has any business in that. And we've heard today the response from some speakers is in response to what's happening to these hostages is to, of course, spread the smear of genocide and of apartheid with having very little to say about the behavior of Hamas. I'm probably the only member here who was in Israel on Saturday evening, and I saw the attack by Iran taking place. I saw the interventions which dealt with that attack, and I'm very proud that US and UK forces were involved in protecting the Middle East's only democratic state. But these were not fireworks that were fired. These were cruise missiles, ballistic missiles, and death drones. They were a real threat to the state of Israel. So when we hear about the need to de-escalate, the escalation happened when Hamas crossed into Israel on October the 7th and butchered 1,200 civilians. It happened when Hamas stole the aid, billions of pounds and dollars of aid, and decided to spend it on terror tunnels. That escalation happened when Iran decided to arm Hamas and Hezbollah. That escalation happened when Hamas decided to embed themselves in schools and in hospitals and in the civilian population. That's when this escalation happened. And the response to this assault by a theocratic terrorist state, by some, is to deny the democratic state of Israel the right to defend itself by calling for an arms embargo. This is indeed a tragedy, Mr. President, but it is a tragedy entirely made in Tehran.
Christophe Lacroix is next.
Je vous remercie, Monsieur le Président, de me donner la parole.
Thank you very much indeed, President, for giving me the floor for such an important debate. And I would like to express my profound indignation, like many other colleagues, following the ongoing destruction of infrastructure in the Gaza Strip since the 7th of October, the day where Israel was attacked by the terrorist organization Hamas. I have heard no one here defending Hamas and Mr. Percy. On the contrary, everybody condemns Hamas, but everyone too, except you, seems to be condemning the disproportionate reaction of Israel and the way in which it is destroying and attacking civilian targets, hospitals, and it's UNICEF that states that. More than some 30,000 civilian victims, more than 3,250 women, more than 13,750 children. You talked about an Israeli child who was assassinated. It is terrible. But did you talk to the parents of these 13,650 children on the Palestinian side? No. Israel is attacking development cooperation infrastructure, including Belgian infrastructure or infrastructure that was funded by the Belgian state, by my government, in all impunity. The UN Secretary General is constantly reminding us that international humanitarian law has been violated both by Hamas and by the disproportionate reaction of Israel. In January, when we had the debate in this assembly, my colleague Simon Mutka was attacked and vilified because he was defending the very same principles that I am today. He was attacked although I hear, and that's good because it denotes progress in terms of the way of which we're reflecting and seeing things today. But he was attacked because he was repeating what we're saying today, that the Israeli reaction is totally disproportionate, and that is enough. And as certain colleagues have said today, what we need is, of course, to call for an immediate ceasefire. We need a rapid de-escalation. We need to release the hostages. We need, as Spain has said, as Malta has done, Ireland and Slovenia, we have to recognize the state of Palestine, and we need to be alongside Palestine in order to ensure democratic, economic, social sovereignty for Palestine. And we have to have the courage, colleagues, as we do in respect of Ukraine, to draw up a register of civil damage and call for Israel to compensate that damage in order to rebuild Palestine and to ensure a lasting peace in this region in the world. Thank you.
Birgir Thorarinsson.
Mr. President, in a recent statement by Fatah, the Palestinian Authority, Fatah accuses Hamas of being ultimately responsible for the situation in Gaza. Fatah spokesperson said that the Hamas leadership is disconnected from reality and the Palestinian people, accusing Hamas of not having itself consulted the other Palestinian leaders before attacking Israel. The brutal terrorist attack that led to the declaration of war by Israel, having caused more than 100,000 people killed or injured. We all know that the terrorist attack on Israel was organized by the Hamas leaders living the luxury life in Qatar. Fatah spokesman said that many of the Hamas leaders living abroad have never visited Palestine. They do not know Palestine. They know Palestine only from the internet. They are the ones disconnected from the reality. In the future, when hopefully the Hamas leaders emerge from where they are hiding, they will be able to take a tour of Gaza, and the children of Gaza will acquaint them with the streets that have been erased and the villages and the buildings that have been destroyed, said the Fatah spokesperson. Gazans on social media continue to hold the leaders of Hamas responsible for the war with Israel, stating that Hamas, despite its claims to the contrary, does not really care about the people of Gaza. In February, there were protests against Hamas in Gaza. People were chanting slogans against Hamas leaders, such as, "Bring down Hamas, we the people are the victims." Hamas security responded by opening fire on the crowds, their own people. Gaza man protesting said that Hamas is shooting hungry people looking for food, and they have involved the people of Gaza in a war that they do not want. The man said, "We want peace. We want our children to go to school. Our children shouldn't be displaced." He went on to accuse Hamas leader Sinwar in Gaza of killing his own people, saying, "It's you, Sinwar, that is killing us Gazans." Mr. President, this devastating humanitarian crisis in Gaza can come to an end today if the Hamas terrorist organization will lay down their weapons and free the hostages.
Mireille Crapo. Mireille Crapo is next.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you very much indeed, President. Colleagues, 3 months ago, we spoke about the situation in Gaza. The situation has developed since then, with finally a vote on an immediate ceasefire held on the 25th of March by the UN Security Council, and there's also been a slight change in the United States position and departure of Israeli troops in Khan Younis. Despite all this, the situation is still very concerning. The new developments have not improved the situation on the front line because bombing, which occurred, in fact, this morning as well, has continued, no doubt as a response to Iran's attack, and the humanitarian crisis is continuing. These these continuous attacks, which are a violation of international law, as reminded us of the High Commissioner for the United Nations for Human Rights, have a very depressing death toll of 30,800 deaths from the Palestinian side. And the Gaza Strip has been described by UNICEF as the most dangerous place in the world for a child. In 2023, more Palestinians were killed than in 15 years of conflict. Colleagues, we need to reiterate our support for a two-state solution, for an end to be brought to the fighting, and for an authorization of enlargement of the humanitarian aid convoys through Israel. Israel was a victim of the 7th of October attacks caused by Hamas, which resulted in 1,116 deaths. Israel has been subject to large-scale bombing from Iran. Israel still has 189 hostages that are held, of the 250 that were kidnapped, and Hamas has stated that it no longer has the 40 hostages that Israel has requested to sign a ceasefire agreement. This is appalling news, and I share the pain of the Israelis, but nothing justifies the deaths caused by bombs or snipers' bullets, as well as deaths as a result of illness and malnutrition, through famine, through lack of health care, and through a wish to wipe out not only Hamas but also human animals that the Israeli government sees in each Gaza, including civilians. The humanitarian aid trucks are arriving very slowly via Rafah. Since yesterday, they've been coming in through the Ashdod Israeli port of Israel, and the products are parachuted in. We'd need there to be 500 trucks a day. Israel is saying that there are 550 trucks in every 2 days. That's not enough. UNRWA, the UN Agency for Refugees, which provided basic social services in the Gaza Strip, paid a very heavy human cost. 178 employees were killed, and it's been accused by Israel. Israel wants to shut it down, but we need to think of how the social services were provided to the Gazans, and we think of what's going to happen after this conflict. If we don't do it for humanitarian reasons, let's think of the security-related consequences there will be if a whole generation is reduced to famine and has no education and security. Our organisation, the Council of Europe, should call on the law and international convention law to be respected, including by hostile states.
Dear colleagues, Armenia is the closest of the Council's countries to the Middle East, so everything that happens and can happen there is critically important and have impact on my country. We are also very concerned because hundreds of thousands of Armenians live in the countries of the region. In Armenia, it's not just enough to adequately understand what is happening in the region and how it may end. We must also define red lines for honest relations with allies, partners, and neighbors in one of the most difficult regions of the world. This is important so that in the era of collapse of the international order, Armenia would not find itself in a geopolitical isolation. One red line is the inviolability of Armenia's security. Turkey and Azerbaijan are consistently trying to resolve the so-called Armenian question through the expulsion of Armenians from their historical homeland. Over the past 100 years, this has happened in Nakhichevan and is happening now in Karabakh. A new war in the Middle East will accelerate the aggressive policy of the Turkic coalition. In order to rationally promote its own national interest, we need also in Armenia to be able to defend ourselves and to prevent a new escalation by having the means to deter any aggressor. Another red line for Armenia is the 44-kilometer border with Iran, which at the moment is not only a source of stability and security for Armenia, but also an opportunity for development. Europe must understand that the good neighborly relations between Armenia and Iran are not directed against anyone. The inability of our partners to facilitate the opening of Armenian-Turkish border should not imply a worsening of the situation on the Armenian-Iranian border. An important red line is the well-being of Armenian communities in the region. During the war in Syria, we have seen the existential challenges the Armenians living there faced. Today, Armenians are Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Iran, but only in Israel they have begun to face real challenges to preserving their historical and civilizational heritage. I call the international community to take immediate and strong actions to prevent negative events around the Armenian quarter of Jerusalem. It is an urgent call to safeguard cultural heritage and defend the rights of the Armenian community within the Holy Land. Mr. President, in conclusion, I would like to stress that Europe must also define its red lines. This is necessary, as EU High Representative Joseph Borrell states, I quoting, to prevent the consolidation of an alliance of the rest against the West, including as the consequences of the Middle East conflict. Thank you.
Nerea Hedo.
Thank you. Lo primero decir que me...
Thank you. The first thing I'd like to say is that I'm happy that we've changed the title of this debate. We're already late in addressing this. All we can do now is try to minimize the damage which has been done. I'd like to start by expressing my clear and absolute condemnation of the Hamas attack. At the same time, I would also extend similarly absolute condemnation of the position adopted by the Israeli government. 6 months in, more than 30,000 deaths, half of them children, women, journalists, thousands of people have been displaced, attacks on humanitarian workers, hospitals, clear violations of international humanitarian law and international law. When we talk about the courage of international organizations, we shouldn't just think about the UN or the European Union. The Council of Europe also has a role to play here, because we've been seeing the way in which human rights are being flagrantly violated. What's difficult to understand is this desire to have a certain equal distance. Let's just say, when it comes to terrorist organizations, what can I do? What can I hope of a terrorist organization? Of course, I can ask them to hand back the hostages. But Israel is a state. Israel is a state, an observer, member of this assembly, which is supposed to defend human rights and implement human rights. As a result, we're fully entitled to demand of Israel that it stops the massacre, that it opens the borders so that humanitarian aid can enter. Women and children are dying of famine. We need a sustainable solution and a ceasefire. Obviously, our states have been calling on Israel to do that, but the problem in practice is Israel has simply wiped Gaza off the face of the earth. The Council of Europe can and should play an important role in this, a role in denouncing the violence, a role in promoting critical thinking. We can also play a diplomatic role in conjunction with other organizations. The Council of Europe has to do everything it can to avoid any further escalation in the region, which would appear to be starting. So this escalation, we can see what's happening in Lebanon, the occupied territories, Iran as well. Any escalation would lead to an unbelievably horrific massacre, and we can't put up with that.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The topic of tomorrow's debate, the protection of children against online violence. What would be added value of this discussion towards what's going on not too far from our continent, with the countries somehow engaged in a cooperation with us? We have a lot of speeches here leading to no action. And this is the most complicated and the most dangerous thing. We cannot say theoretically we should protect children, we should protect theoretical children, and we cannot take into consideration the real situation on the ground with the children. Ask a small boy or girl in Gaza or Israel or vice versa what's going on. Try to explain them what's going on, why we are under shelling, why we have a shortage of food. It's very complicated to explain to anybody of them. But unfortunately, we usually try to blame the others for their shortcomings. but we first of all should look at ourselves. Whether we have very precise answers, whether we have precise reaction on what's going on. Unfortunately, very often political considerations prevail over the values we should to follow. My dear colleague Damien Coetzee from Switzerland mentioned Jean-Henri Dunant and international humanitarian law, and here we should also have very precise and firm answer, because the very idea of Jean-Henri Dunant and Geneva Convention is the following: doesn't matter who is right and who is wrong, who has the right to self-defense, who is not. If you engage in war, you should respect without any discrimination all the rules prescribed in Geneva Conventions. Unfortunately, very often we apply even so-called legal acrobatics, trying not to call the things by the names of which we are. Unfortunately, very often we are facing the situation of general discussion without trying to go ahead with the actions. Unfortunately, when we are trying to prevent this or that conflict, we are forgetting that the best way of general prevention of the current conflicts is condemnation of the conflicts we faced before. Thank you so much.
Frédéric Mathieu.
Monsieur le Président.
President, colleagues, I think we can never remind ourselves too much of this. We've said it on so many occasions. Unfortunately, it wasn't unanimous, and I do regret this. But the Gazan massacre will not bring back to life the victims of the appalling massacres perpetrated by Hamas on the 7th of October. The Gazan massacre will not bring back the hostages to Israel. How many thousands and thousands of people continue to have to die before we can realize this? There's literally no point carrying out policies in this way. How many tens of thousands of deaths do they want to cause until they realize that there's no point in doing this? The only thing it's going to cause, it's going to basically cause great injury and great harm to the international situation, and it's going to fragilize the important work done by this Assembly and the Council of Europe and other institutions to promote compliance with international law and international humanitarian law. This is what it's doing. It's going to sort of undo everything that's already been done, what we tried to develop with regard to human rights. It needs to stop immediately. I'll be very brief here. I think the most urgent thing is for us to all fight to ensure there's an immediate ceasefire. It's only an immediate ceasefire that will enable us to open up a proper forum for discussion. Now, of course, it's going to be difficult and fraught with problems, but I do know we do have people in our institution who are willing to be intermediaries and help discussions. We need to open up a window of discussion to provide an ease to the suffering of the Palestinian people. We need a window of discussion to open up to enable the hostages to be released and return to their families as soon as possible. This is what we should expect and call on. And I think we should stop thinking that massacring people and building up dead bodies is going to sort out the situation. It's not going to do so. Thank you.
Francesco Sorbara.
Honourable colleagues, in Canada, as I'm sure is the case in many of your countries, the war in Gaza continues to divide us. Canadians mourn the lives lost in the worst attack on the Jewish people since the Shoah, deplore the ongoing captivity of the over 130 hostages, and demand that Hamas be accountable. Hamas is a terrorist organization linked and funded to Iran, and it must release the hostages. They also condemn the direst of humanitarian catastrophes, children literally starving to death, the bombing of schools and hospitals, and the widespread displacement of the Palestinian people. It is estimated that over 30,000 Palestinians have died, a very high price for the people to pay. Increasingly, however, we're being told that we can't do both. To empathize with one community is to betray the other. It's harder and harder to find common ground. and both anti-Semitism and Islamophobia are on the rise in Canada and around the world. For that reason, I was heartened to see an overwhelming majority of this Assembly in the January session pass a balanced and constructive resolution based on our colleague Piero Fassino's equally balanced and constructive report. That resolution, to reiterate, condemned in the strongest terms Hamas's barbaric October 7th attack, while acknowledging Israel's right to self-defense and the reality that Hamas will have to be dismantled. At the same time, the resolution called for a permanent ceasefire, voiced sorrow and dismay at the staggering number of innocent Palestinian casualties, and called on all parties to ensure rapid, safe, and unhindered access to humanitarian assistance for the population in Gaza, and abide by international law and international humanitarian law. To Israel specifically, the resolution also called for an end in the occupied territories of settler violence, the expansion of settlements, home demolitions, forced evictions, and the confiscation of land. Looking ahead, and let's look ahead, please, to the so-called day after, those final points are vital, because as long has been the official position of the Government of Canada, and as the January resolution reiterated, there can be no just and lasting peace in the Middle East without the creation of a Palestinian state living side by side in peace and security with Israel. Thank you.
Kimmo Kiljunen.
Mr. President, 2 weeks ago, I visited in Palestine and Israel, meeting the political leadership on both sides. The country is full of fear, bitterness, hate, and international communities having too many double standards. That's my questions, and I have lots of confusing questions to you to address. First, is it so that everything started 7th of October last year? Or is it actually a vicious circle of decades, even centuries? Is it so that one war crime justifies other war crimes? Is it so that one is using civilized way, modern weaponry, the system including missiles, and one other one is using non-civilized way in brute, crude knives? Are we saying that on one side, please respect human lives, even children's lives, when using military means, and other side, we are condemning straight away, you are doing brutal terrorism? I am confused. Please help me. My last questions. I asked in Knesset with the Foreign Affairs chairperson, Committee of International Affairs chairperson, Yuli Edelstein. I understand Palestinian terrorism is for you, Israelis, an existence question. I heard Palestinians saying Jewish expansionism in the region is for them an existence question. And he answered me, Kimmo, listen, I know Palestinians have lived here, they are living here, and they will live here. We Jews, we are living here, and we will live here. And I shook hands with him. You gave the answer. And my last question to you, we are demanding here two-state model. Today in the region, actually nobody believes on that one. Jews are saying, Israel is saying, we keep the promised land we reached 1967. And the Palestinians are more and more saying, no, the two-state model is your model. That would mean for us, typical protectorate system, traditional Bandostan. Let's live in one state where our national identity will be respected and we have the civil rights. My question to you, is that an answer?
Sadagaran Beluk.
Chers collègues,
Colleagues, on our planet, roughly 1 billion tons of food is wasted every year. Yet, 2.3 million people in Gaza, internally displaced and forced to stay in a very small area, are facing hunger, and scores of babies are dying of malnutrition. The Commissioner General of UNRWA, Mr. Lazzarini, said in his latest statement, I quote, "All lines, including the red lines, have been crossed, and the war is made worse by the famine born from an Israeli-imposed siege, which is eating up bodies of babies and young children." To what extent are we, the parliamentarians of the Council of Europe, which is regarded as the centre of human rights and the rule of law, aware of the red lines that have been crossed in Gaza? Dear parliamentarians, Israel is allowing practically no food or medical supplies into the territory. The war on Gaza has resulted in a 90% loss of electricity, which is affecting hospitals, sewage treatment plants, and is leading to the closure of drinking water desalination plants. Widespread epidemics have broken out throughout the Gaza Strip. Intensive bombing by the Israeli Air Force has caused huge damage to Gaza's infrastructure, further compounding the crisis. The Gaza Ministry of Health has reported that more than 4,000 children had died in the first month of the war. And now we're talking about more than 14,000. The Secretary General of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres, said that Gaza had turned into a children's graveyard. A children's graveyard. The images of Gaza's Shifa hospital are a worrying example of the collapse of the health system. It was devastated by Israeli attacks on hospitals and health facilities and by the killing of health workers and the blocking of medical supplies into Gaza. Dear colleagues, in the face of this unprecedented disaster, Turkey is doing everything in its power to improve the situation. Today, Turkey is the leading donor of aid to Gaza, providing 20% of total aid to the population. In addition, Turkey delivers an average of 127 tons of drinking water from Egypt to Gaza every week. More than 400 sick and injured Gazans are being treated in Turkey. The Turkish Red Crescent has launched a new aid ship that will deliver continuous aid to Gaza. Turkey stands by Gaza and will continue to do so. But here, as parliamentarians in the Council of Europe, well, where are we going to draw the line? And when are we going to say that Israel's atrocities must stop? We in this Parliamentary Assembly did not draw the line when Israel was bombing hospitals. We didn't draw the line when journalists were being killed. Nor did we draw the line when innocent civilians were massacred. Colleagues, what we must do in our common European home, in Europe, that is to decide where we draw the line. Are we going to continue to remain indifferent and watch innocent lives and civilian infrastructure being destroyed because we do not have the courage to accuse Israel? Or are we going to call for an end to this humanitarian disaster? That is what we're going to decide today. Thank you very much indeed.
Saskia Kluit.
Thank you. Dear friends, we all know how difficult the discussions on this conflict are. But despite all the emotions and all the struggles that we have, I think it's really good that we talk together today about the situation. And I want to thank all of you that made this possible, because it's not an easy discussion to have. We have two partners who are in our midst, well, on the screen today, but who have a big conflict and that has big consequences for people in the area. But I think it's important we talk here because we are the human rights organization and we can use especially our organization to improve the terrible situation, not only to reflect on it, but especially to act on it. I liked what my colleague Varda Jan said about it. We should not only talk, we should act. So I would like to focus on the people who are the gravest danger today. And I plead to our organization to immediately start working on improving the situation of the most vulnerable people. Many of my colleagues have already spoken wise words and insightful words about the gravity of the human rights situation in general, but I think it's especially important to talk about the children and the women. And not only in Gaza and West Bank, but also in Israel. So I have tabled a motion today, and I hope, President, I look at you, if you could speed it up as fast as we can, because every day we win is a good day to start acting. Having talked to many of you this week, I know that while we might disagree on some things, we all stand very much united in our concerns for the most vulnerable people in this conflict. The children, whether they are from Israel, West Bank or Gaza, and their mothers. And by now we have all heard those many and awful stories, and they are heart-wrenching. Children who miss their dad or hostage parents, or they miss their safety of their house or their school. We have heard about children who missed critical medical care, who have been amputated without good health care or even sedation. And that is when you need it most. And lately we also heard from organizations like the WHO or Save the Children that there's a lack of food and drink. And they have expressed extremely grave concerns about the food situation. They called it an alarming man-made famine. And we know that this immense suffering continues until today, and most of us want it to end today. Some have reminded us today that the very heart and soul of this organization is at stake if we do not act. So I hope today that we will unite and can be united on the human rights-based approach in this conflict, the heart of our organization. And we should start by ending at least the suffering of the young and the vulnerable in this region. The Council as a whole, including the Committee of Ministers and our base Parliament, should act. We can help to end current violent human rights violations, and we should start working on improving them. A ceasefire and restoration of food is the least. And I will end, President. Let's end with the words that were spoken by football fans. They are always the most wise persons in the world. They said in many stadiums last month, be silent when the children sleep, but don't be silent when the children die.
Sabina Kudic.
Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, I have a small question for you. Some of you are old enough to might have been politically active some decades ago. Some of you maybe remember the 90s. And my question is, do you remember where you were in the summer of 1992? Maybe some of you got married, maybe some of you got involved in politics, graduated, or perhaps summer of 93, or perhaps summer of 94, or perhaps summer of 95. In summer of 95, I was in my hometown of Sarajevo, watching my schoolmates being killed in the most gruesome ways a child can be killed. And as naive as a child can be, I wondered where you were, and I hope that you're coming to rescue. And there may be a situation in 10 years or 20 years or so where there may be a Palestinian child survivor here asking us the same question where we were in the spring of 2024. The uncomfortable truth, and as truth is often uncomfortable, is that atrocities we ignore have a tendency to come back to haunt us. The same way that we will rightly so be forever haunted by the failure of this continent to prevent Holocaust. And of course, the children will wonder the way I wondered, whether the promise of never again, which again, as a naive child, I believed, turns into a hypocritical promise of again and again and again. I took the time to read the biographies and devastating testimonies of families of Israeli hostages. I made sure I find out about them as much as I could. I wonder if you did the same for the thousands of dead children of Gaza. And here is the reason why you didn't and why you couldn't. Because if you did, and if we were to read the names of children killed in Gaza here, we would stay here for days. So the idea of balanced reporting, the idea of measured reporting, disgusts me. It disgusts me because there is nothing measured, there is nothing acceptable, and it is not a self-defense to kill unarmed children in the name of self-defense. And it is unacceptable that we put these two things together. After we silenced all the activists in various member states, who's next? thousands of brave and amazing Jewish intellectuals and activists who are raising their voice for ceasefire. Some of your countries are running out of Jews intellectuals to censor and take away their prizes because they raise their voices for ceasefire. There is a reason why there are no great European leaders or world leaders for that matter today. It's because we chose in the past decades, and we continue to choose, political scheming and calculations instead of inspiring people. And again, this will come back to haunt us. Thank you.
Christiana Rotokritou.
Thank you, Mr. President. Dear colleagues, it is extremely difficult to discuss ways in which this Assembly could alleviate the terrible human suffering in Gaza as the bloodshed continues and as the only interlocutors in the conflict are the State of Israel on the one hand and the terrorist organization, namely Hamas, on the other. How can one sit around the negotiating table with a terrorist organization? How can one compromise with Hamas? The Palestinian Authority is unfortunately absent in this equation, ineffective and weak. The situation is complex and our role is particularly difficult. 3 months ago, PACE urged for a ceasefire. Today, 3 months on, none of the hostages have been released, the war is ongoing, and Iran has just launched drones and ballistic missiles on Israel. Iran's unprecedented attack on Israel is a blatant violation of international law, aiming at setting the entire Middle East on fire, and must be internationally condemned as such. So what can be done? We must insist on the immediate release of all the hostages and a simultaneous and immediate ceasefire. At the same time, it is imperative that we step up all efforts for the timely deliverance of humanitarian aid to Gaza and make clear to all stakeholders that such aid will not be allowed to fall into the hands of Hamas, who has unfortunately in the past seized humanitarian aid, used it for its own needs, and then sold the rest of it at exorbitant prices to the desperate Palestinian people. I live in a country, Mr. President, that is roughly 200 kilometers away from Gaza. The Republic of Cyprus has always sought and achieved friendly and neighbourly relations with all Arab nations, as well as Israel. Cyprus has proposed and implemented the Amalthea Project, a maritime corridor for the transfer of humanitarian aid to Gaza, which has been heralded by the international community as a prime example of how we can act together and take responsible and effective action. Regrettably, the killing of the 7 aid workers of the World Central Kitchen Organization has set operations on hold, but as soon as conditions allow, activities will resume. Regarding Iran, it is quite obvious that Iran can export its aggression and instability not only via terrorist organizations that it funds and controls, namely Hezbollah and Hamas, but by hijacking, in essence, entire countries like Syria and Lebanon. Europe has, in a very short-sighted and introvert manner, been absent from the Middle East region, and especially the southeastern Mediterranean, despite the fact that it sits on its immediate periphery. It is quite clear that Europe cannot be stable until its periphery is stable. Clawing back countries and political systems from the nails of Iran and religious fundamentalists is not an easy feat, but it is the only viable option. As long as the European Union does not have a clear footprint and strategic depth in the Middle East, it is unlikely that we will be able to play a leading role in the region, stabilizing it or trying to provide a valid and sustainable alternative to radical terrorism. Thank you.
Abdurrahman Babatsan.
Thank you. As you know, the Council of Europe is a broad umbrella organization established after World War II to expand the notion of human rights, peace, and democracy from there to reach out to Immanuel Kant's perpetual peace ideal in the 18th century. But now there is a discussion about the dysfunction of Europe in general, both during Cold War and aftermath period of the Cold War. And we lastly saw this in Gaza, in the massacre in Gaza by Israel throughout 7 months. However, Europe has remained silent on the murder of 25,000 of people, and 75 of whom are children and women. with no connection with Hamas policies, as we all know, and Europe has systematically and deliberately ignored the crimes of Israel by taking a politically pro-Israel position. This created a deep disappointment among all over the world, and even the younger generations within itself, the European countries. So my question is about to all European political elites that how they cannot see the political elites, economic elites, and intellectual elites in Europe cannot see this robust in the deep wave of the younger generations within itself. And also, what I see that there are certain codes of enemies within the Europe, some sourced by global media manipulations and big political, theological, historical, and ideological baggages. And these has been dominated by poisonous and false discourse of codes of animosity that unfortunately serves all the Muslims within that package. So this results as in Gaza today, a brutally murdered, for instance, Muslim baby in Gaza, child or Muslim child being trivialized under this label. So this is a big problem for European political elites, I guess. At the end of the day, this manufactured concept of enemy creates a blinding function for the European political elites, I guess. This is an idea, this is a mindset produced also with the great contribution of extreme manipulation and huge global media power, which is, I guess, sourced and founded by Israel and also Zionist packages. So even this is a racism, a kind of a racism, and also this is an anti-Muslim hatred and also even an anti-Christian hatred. This is also. So if Europe wants to set a leadership mission for itself from now on, it must first shape it on the basis of moral, political and legal norms. In this respect, the Gaza incident was actually an opportunity for Europe. But Europe could not. Also, the opportunity to break the global world order that US has been advancing for many years, but Europe unfortunately could not overcome these historical, theological, and contextual baggages, and so now I am not sure about from now on for Europe, how will it be possible for Europe to truly defend the democracy and human rights and convince all over the world and younger generations within also Europe itself. It's a big question for Europe's future. Thanks.
Suna Evarsdottir.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Mr. President. Colleagues, many of you have stated that this conflict started on the 7th of October last year with Hamas's reprehensible attack on Israel and its citizens and the taking of hundreds of hostages, an act which I condemn wholeheartedly. But this conflict did not start on October 7th. It started with decades of illegal occupation of Palestinian lands. It started with decades of systematic ethnic cleansing of Palestinians, with decades of disenfranchisement, humiliation, and murder of Palestinians, including by summary executions. It started with decades of colonialist dispossession of Palestinian lands by illegal Israeli settlers. This all happened before October 7th, under the largely silent Council of Europe, as well as the largely silent international community as a whole. And the title of this debate is testament towards this indifference towards Palestinian rights, towards Palestinian lives. The deliberate bombing of hospitals, refugee camps, schools, UN facilities, ambulances, journalists. It is not a catastrophe, it's a war crime. The murder of 15,000 children is not a catastrophe. It forms the part of a gradual and intentional ethnic cleansing of the Palestinian people. The people, the children of Gaza, are being starved to death before our very eyes, not because of famine or drought or other catastrophes, but because of the deliberative actions of Israel, whose officials have publicly declared their genocidal intent. What we are seeing in Gaza is no catastrophe. These are war crimes, they are crimes against humanity, and they are possibly genocide, and we are not doing anything to stop it. And instead of trying to stop it, many of our governments are actively facilitating these crimes. It is a shame for our continent. It is something that we need to call all of our governments to account for. We must call for a ceasefire now. We must boycott Israel. We must end the occupation. We must free Palestine now.
Olympia Giron Hernandez.
Gracias, presidente.
Thank you, President. The situation in Israel and the Gaza Strip is taking on horrific and unexpected dimensions. On the one hand, Mexico has condemned the non-inclusion of Gaza in the Israeli land. We also condemn the killing of certain Mexicans during the attacks. On the other hand, we also condemn the disproportionate attack by Israeli forces on Gaza, which has left us with one of the most desolate images we've seen in recent years in the world. Mexico reiterates its deep concern regarding the situation, the profound humanitarian catastrophe which this situation has generated, in particular the death of thousands of civilians and the destruction of infrastructure. We welcome the decisions taken by the International Court in The Hague, which ordered Israel to take necessary measures to avoid the committing of acts of genocide against the civilian population of Palestine. This would include not committing assassinations, respecting the physical and mental integrity of any prisoners, to not intentionally create situations which would lead to the total or partial physical deprivation of those people. The court also orders that inciting genocide and preventing the entry of international humanitarian assistance should be outlawed. Mexico calls on all those involved to instigate an immediate and sustainable ceasefire. We have to bring the suffering of the civilian population to an end immediately, and we have to create a space so that the parties to the conflict can negotiate to bring a conflict to the end. The government of Mexico reiterates its support to the two-state solution. We believe this is the only possible political and definitive solution to the conflict. Finally, I'd like to thank everybody for the support we've received from many members of this Assembly following the violent attack on the Mexican embassy on the 5th of April in Ecuador. And we would be grateful if this Assembly could adopt a unanimous resolution so as to avoid events such as that we're talking about becoming something which repeats itself over and over again.
Mr. Loukaides.
I will speak in Greek, if I may allow.
Of course.
Έχω ακούσει τη συζήτηση μέχρι τώρα.
Yes, I've been following the discussion, and I'd like to start by telling you that all the events, all the information has been recorded by colleagues, and also by the Secretary General of the United Nations. And he said recently, and I quote him, that the war in Gaza is a war that has caused the most loss of lives compared to all conflicts up today. That means that the war in Gaza has caused huge suffering, huge hunger. He said a number of other things in response to Ms. Banery and other colleagues who talked about misinformation. Israel has killed 100 journalists. And from the word to the Secretary General, we can conclude that international journalists can still not enter Gaza. But why? Who is responsible for this misinformation? Well, is it perhaps Israel that's accusing other people of misinformation? And the Secretary General of the United Nations also replied with regard to the murder of 7 people from World Kitchen by stating that 179 humanitarian workers, most of whom were working for an organization that was not an error. This was part of a strategy followed by the Israeli army in Gaza. Now, I don't have time to mention. Do you have longer? The President says you have an extra minute. Yes, well, if you can give me a bit more time, I'd be grateful, because I've just stopped speaking for a few seconds. So these events have occurred and they speak for themselves. And what I'd like to point out is that I'm very dismayed by the Council of Europe's lack of action. All we've done up to now is to vote on a resolution which didn't call for an unconditional permanent ceasefire. It simply called on Israel to continue what it was doing in Gaza. In other words, carry out genocide until the complete dismantlement of Hamas. That's what we called for. In other words, the genocide is continuing. Now, let me also add that this resolution and the support for Israel, which is military support, is not only something in which we're tolerating this genocide, it's sort of conniving, it's aiding and abetting genocide. And if we want to maintain our dignity in the face of this war, which has cost the lives of thousands of people, then we need to have the courage and strength to condemn. And within the left, our friends have never shied away from condemning Hamas, but we need to condemn as well Israel. We can't turn a blind eye to the attack perpetrated on the Israeli embassy, nor the attacks on Gaza. We can't have double standards, because if we do have double standards, this is simply going to undermine the reliability and the dignity of the Council of Europe. President, you and also the Council as a whole really need to change its position. We need to keep maintain dignity and reliability. Thank you.
Merci, Monsieur le Président, chers collègues.
Thank you, President. Ladies and gentlemen, the background to today's debate took place before the Council was set up 75 years ago, but it's still relevant. The terrible attacks committed by Hamas on 7th of October led to the international community broadly recognizing Israel's right to self-defense. At the same time, anticipating no doubt a disproportionate response, they set out clearly that any action should respect the international humanitarian rules, refraining from attacking civilians. Now, we are faced with an unprecedented humanitarian crisis in the Gaza Strip. So far, 34,000 people have been killed in the enclave, including a majority of women and children. UN agencies report that women who've survived, or children, sorry, who've survived the bombing are unlikely to survive the following famine. In other words, this humanitarian crisis is far from over, on the contrary. Last month, I spoke in the House of Commons supporting a resolution calling for an immediate ceasefire and the release of all the hostages, pointing out that organizations such as Doctors Without Frontiers have also been attacked by Israel since the 7th of October. I never expected that 2 weeks later, 7 humanitarian workers working for an international organization, including a young Quebecer, would be killed. This attack triggered off a wave of shock. But the reality is that since the very beginning of the conflict, these things have been happening. There's nothing unusual about this. Since the tragic events of the 7th of October, more than 200 humanitarian workers have been killed while trying to support the people of Gaza. In other words, it's essential that this Assembly take a close look to see what the Council of Europe can do to bring to an end this tragedy unfolding in front of our eyes, and which now risks lighting a powder keg in the whole region. On the 29th of January, this Assembly called on its members to extend their full support to a two-state solution and to create the conditions which are necessary for a sustainable peace in the Middle East. This is essential if Israelis and Palestinians are to cease living in a situation of permanent war. But the only way this would be possible with an independent Palestine and a peace agreement between the two states. Thank you.
Petra Bayer.
Ja, ich möchte
I'd like to pick up on what my colleague was saying with regard to Iran. Now, Iran has a huge interest in destabilizing the entire region, and the attacks on Israel of the past few days was an aim on the part of Iran, of course, to destabilize the region. Iran has been supporting Hamas for quite some time with weapons, with money, with know-how, logistics. And I think we need to bear this in mind as well, because if you look at the fact that Hamas has caused Palestinians to be almost used as shields when there's a threat of bombing, and this is something I think that's a part of the calculation that's made by Hamas, and I think this reprehensible policy carried out by Hamas, but this having been said, this is no way of legitimizing what is actually happening in Gaza. Now, more than 1 million people in Rafah, Palestinian civilians, have sought refuge in this region, and the humanitarian situation is very, very serious indeed. Now, of course, it's something we can't stand for, and humanitarian aid needs to be delivered as quickly as possible to the Gaza Strip, and it needs to come to the people living there, and it shouldn't be diverted by Hamas for their own use. Now, the Israeli hostages should be unconditionally released, and I underline the word unconditionally. And with regard to the 7th of October attacks, I think the perpetrators of these attacks, the people that instigated these, need to be held accountable for it. They need to be held accountable for a court of law. And I'd like to place special emphasis also on the issue of the sexual violence that was perpetrated. And this picks up on the report on sexual violence that we had last year in the plenary assembly and in the context of Ukraine. But this also concerns the Balkans as well, and it concerns Israel at the moment, because there have been countless cases of sexual violence, people being raped, and this did not only occur on the 7th of October, it's continuing to occur because people are experiencing this who are Hamas hostages, and not just women but also men. And I'm very much struck by the fact that there are people, women who are feminists, who are sort of negating or denying that this is the case. We need to ensure that people are held accountable for their actions, and that this is brought to an end, that women's bodies should not be seen as a battlefield.
Danke sehr, Herr Präsident.
Thank you, President. I would like to start by saying I agree with George Lukaidis, who said clearly we're talking here about a genocide directed against the people of Palestine. I can say in recent history, we have very rarely seen levels of violence and brutality such as those the people of Gaza are experiencing. This is a war being conducted against women and children. The vast majority of those killed and those being starved to death are women and children. So we can certainly describe this as genocide. And it's an absolute violation of all aspects of international humanitarian law. So Iron Sword, that's the name of this operation, the Israeli operation in the Gaza Strip, seems to bring with it a clear threat of ethnic cleansing. And that's demonstrated by the series of massacres we've seen. So the question I ask is, what does Israel imagine when it comes to the rebuilding of Gaza? Up to 90% of all housing and infrastructure has been destroyed. including hospitals, schools, and so on. All of this is quite unacceptable. And Israel must be held to account, including financially, for the damage it has caused. However, the war against Palestinians didn't start on the 7th of October. It started much, much longer ago. Prior to the 7th of October, there were numerous murders of Palestinians on the West Bank carried out by Israeli settlers, and practically no one hears about this. The fact is, the World Kitchen, which lost 7 of its employees, had informed the Israeli army about its movements. And current subsequent reconstruction of what happened showed that there was a second attack, a third attack, and each time more and more people were killed, and finally the last ones were killed in the 4th attack. So obviously somebody must be held to account. We've heard about the hundreds of journalists who've been simply killed. And somebody said quite clearly today, the only solution must be based on a two-state solution. Stability and sustainable peace require that. The world must help find peace, but to bring the conflict to an end so that peace can take over, we need a two-state solution.
None of us have ever witnessed anything like this. War crimes are happening in real time before our eyes. Shocking images reach us through our screens, but there is deafening silence. The world should be ashamed that there is no safe space in Gaza and that starvation is being used as a weapon of war. Today, it is the greatest open-air graveyard, not only for tens of thousands of innocent lives lost, but also for many of the most fundamental principles of humanitarian law, according to international organizations. Almost 14,000 children killed by Israeli forces, 17,000 children separated, over 9,000 women killed, 180 give birth daily with no medical help, babies without milk, but none of it evokes the necessary empathy. Israel's massacres in Gaza have reminded the world community of its promise, never again. Do we remember? The level of violence and dehumanization of Palestinians that has been normalized is incredibly concerning. The principle of human dignity must apply to all people. Yet those always talking about human rights, freedom and democracy just watch Israel's massacres from a distance, incapable of taking any action. There can be no double standards when we speak about human rights. This assembly rightly maintained a firm stance over the Russian aggression on Ukraine and continues its work to relieve the impact of the war and to stop it. Such a strong response against the flagrant violation of international law by Israel is the obligation of this assembly if we are committed to the founding principles of the Council of Europe. Therefore, I call on this assembly to show a unified and strong position on the humanitarian tragedy in Palestine. Moreover, Turkey's warnings about the risk of spillover and escalation of Israel's ongoing war in Gaza have long been repeated to all our counterparts. The Israeli attack on the Iranian embassy in Damascus, Iran's retaliation to this attack, and subsequent developments have once again demonstrated that every event could quickly escalate into a regional war. As Turkey, we have been coordinating diplomatic efforts on the Palestinian issue from the very beginning. We have also expressed Turkey's willingness to take on the role of a guarantor in the conflict and have emphasized that there is only one solution to bring security and stability to the region, and that is a two-state solution. Now, first and foremost, there must be an immediate ceasefire. Israel must stop its deadly attacks, allow humanitarian aid into Gaza, and put an end to its illegal settlements and occupation. Thank you.
Alexis Tsipras is next.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. On November 13, 1973, Willy Brandt was the first head of government to address the European Parliament here in Strasbourg. His first words in that historic speech before he spoke about European unification were about the Middle East. He said, "The tragedy in the Middle East, which is so close to us, not only geographically but also culturally and historically, require of me to speak as a German and as a European. The conflict is also a challenge to Europe. What goes on in this agonized neighboring region affects us directly. Europe must therefore, if it can, contribute towards solving that problem, and this it can only do in the closest of cooperation." And I'm wondering, where is Europe in the current tragedy in the Middle East? Dear colleagues, I'm afraid on the Middle East today, Europe is not on the right side of history. A few kilometers from our borders in Palestine, nearly 34,000 people are killed from Israeli military operations, 70% of which, Mr. Borrell says, are innocent civilians. A humanitarian crisis with over 2 million people is taking place. Hamas is a terrorist organization, and we absolutely condemn the terrorist attacks of the 7th of October. But what is happening now with thousands of children being killed will strengthen extremism for generations, leading to much less, not more, security for the region and for Israelis. We condemn Iranian attacks and support for Hamas, but if Israel chooses to respond militarily, as it did in Damascus, escalation is certain and millions will be in danger. If we actually stand for what we say, and if we really believe in what we say, we must, in very clear terms, declare that there has to be an immediate and lasting ceasefire in Gaza with the return of all hostages. We must declare clearly that we stand against military escalation. We must support the end of occupation, the restart of reliable talks for a two-state solution. And the EU must at last take a stand and push forward for a peace conference that should include, as the Spanish and Irish Prime Ministers have said, the prospect of recognition of a Palestinian state on the basis of a solution with international guarantees for Israel. I'm concluding. If we continue playing with words or obstructing public discussions like what happened in Germany, then we're sending the message around the world that European values are nothing but hypocrisy. We send the message that our rules lead to double standards. But the truth is, either European values are relevant everywhere, or they are not values at all. Thank you very much.
Zeynep Yildiz.
Dear Chair, dear colleagues, the Council of Europe, under the umbrella of where we are, was established after the bloodiest war the world has ever seen for the purposes of realization of human rights and fundamental freedoms, as foreseen in Article 1 of the founding statute. Beyond the continental reservations, acting in accordance with the founding purposes, taking an initiative for the resolution of conflicts and preserving world peace is the only reason for functionalizing this institution. That's why we are here. First of all, the Palestinian-Israeli conflict did not start on October 7. Gaza has been an open-air prison for years under the Israeli siege. Children were born in the refugee camps, and they grew up without any idea of what the normal life is outside. Palestinians passing through checkpoints in the West Bank is subjected to deep humiliation every day, and their right to live in dignity is violated. Due to the illegal settlers of Israel, property rights of Palestinian people in West Bank are unlawfully taken away. For the last 6 months, we have been in a shame similar to the shame of not being able to stop Auschwitz. United Nations Special Rapporteur on Palestine, Francesca Albanese, states that there are reasonable grounds to believe that the crime of genocide has been committed against Palestinians. More than 30,000 Palestinians, including more than 14,000 children, were killed in Gaza, accounting for approximately 1.4% of the whole population. It's estimated that more than 12,000 missing people died. 71,000 people were injured, many with lifelong disabilities. 70% of residential areas were completely destroyed. 80% of the entire population was forcibly displaced. The blockade of Gaza has prevented access to vital supplies, causing deaths from starvation of 10 people in each day. Journalists, medical doctors were killed, hospitals, mosques, and churches were targeted disproportionately. These are all done by Israel. What kind of democracy is this? Dear colleagues, in order to make our presence here meaningful, we must succeed in becoming a true representative of human rights apart from our political engagements and the interest groups. We must take an initiative for an urgent implementation of United Nations Security Council Resolution number 2728, and for ensuring sufficient humanitarian aid enters Gaza, we can form an impartial monitoring mission under the umbrella of peace. We must call for an immediate ceasefire and call both sides for the release of all hostages and prisoners, and ultimately ensure the return of Gazans and all Palestinians to their own lands within the framework of international law. In conclusion, politics is made with people and for people, and we as politicians should be a voice for peaceful protesters, stand for Palestine all around the world. Turkey stood with Palestine and will continue to do so. When we return our countries, we must have an honorable story to tell our people. We must free Palestine. Leve Palestina, yaşasın Filistin, aşet Filistin. Thank you very much.
Laura Castell.
Thank you, Chair. Dear colleagues, staying silent in the face of a genocide is equivalent to backing the perpetrators. That is why I really think this current affairs debate is so needed. We are a human rights organization, and Israel and Palestine are both linked with. We, as Council of Europe, can and must play a more active role in the protection of the human rights in Gaza and in Palestine. Dear colleagues, it's in hard times when it's more necessary contribute through the aspirations of life, liberty, dignity, and fraternity. It's in hard times when they are more necessary, because it is all about values, vision, and courage. Values. We are based on values. We are the champions of the human rights, and our cornerstone is the European Convention of Human Rights that protects the right of life as the frontispiece of the rest of the rights and freedoms. Without life, we have nothing. But in addition of values, we need vision and courage. Vision to face and deal complex questions, and courage to defend human rights without double standards. We must have the courage to affect strategic allies without fear, because it's our duty to be the champions of the human rights. We are not a geopolitical organization. For this purpose exist United Nations, NATO, European Union, or the OSCE. We are for the human rights. Dear colleagues, double standards are dangerous, since they only reinforce impunity and perpetuate instability. At the same time, double standards also undermine credibility of the member states' actions in defense of international humanitarian law and human rights in other scenarios. In January, it was shocking how this assembly were showing alarming passivity in front of the genocide. We are supposed to be allies in defending human rights. But reality shows that economical and geostrategical interests have taken ahead declarations, summits, or statements on human rights and rule of law. It is time, then, to address the real causes of this conflict, dismantle the apartheid system, stop the illegal blocking to which Gaza is subjected, urge the end of these illegal attacks on innocent people. It has already been said, almost 14,000 dead children. 14,000 dead children could fill this building. It's unbearable. Further, it has to be suspended the sale of weapons to Israel, since they commit violations of human rights and crimes against humanity. And finally, an immediate and permanent ceasefire is needed, with no conditions. Hamas should release all Israeli hostages. Israel should release Palestinians arbitrarily detained. An immediate humanitarian corridor must be set up immediately. Thousands of children can't wait any longer. And last but not least, and I'm finished, we should urge for a two-state solution and consequently urge for the recognition of Palestine. We, as Council of Europe, can do more. The Assembly, the Secretary General, the Committee of Ministers, the Commission of Human Rights, all of us. So I propose a next step. Release a clear common statement in favor of human rights and diplomacy solution. Thank you, Chair, for your passions, and thank you.
Mustafa Chambey.
Dear President, distinguished colleagues, unfortunately today, we are here to discuss one of the most complex and devastating human catastrophe in modern history, the massacre of Gaza. As the Assembly, it is pivotal to address this issue with empathy for the innocent civilians and develop a sustainable solution. Since the beginning of the conflict on 7 October, more than 33,000 people have been killed, and the number is still rising. As the representative of the Council of the Europe member states, we are faced with one of the most destructive catastrophes of the Middle East as well as the world. The innocent civilians in Gaza have been suffering from unjust and unlawful attacks from Israel. Moreover, due to the Israeli blockage of the Gaza Strip, the innocent civilians have been sentenced to rubbles, hunger, and thirst. Most of the people who lost their lives are women and children, who are also suffering from shortages of food and basic human needs. This situation is also threatening the global peace. Although it is evident that Israel is responsible for disproportionate number of civilian casualties, nothing has been done. Having ACJ has ruled that Israel must cease fire, stop killing civilians, and allow humanitarian aid in the region. People are still suffering. The recent armed conflict between Israel and Iran shown once again that unless a permanent solution in Gaza is reached, there will be no peace and stability in the Middle East. The Assembly should ask Israel to follow and enforce the judgment of the ACJ. Even though this judgment is not a permanent solution, it will provide an important relief to the civilians in Gaza. The Assembly should ask Israel to follow and I believe our Assembly has their moral compass intact and will strive to uphold the rule of law and human rights. Lastly, I invite our Assembly to commence a process to exert pressure on Israel for a permanent ceasefire and for allowing aid to be sent to the Gaza Strip immediately. Thank you for your attention.
Çelik Kanat.
Dear President, dear colleagues, Israel transformed Gaza from an open-air prison to a mass grave for civilians, killing over 34,000 people, including 14,000 children, 10,000 women, hundreds of journalists, aid workers and doctors, wounding 75,000 and displacing 1.7 million people and destroying 70% of civilian infrastructure in Gaza. Israel continues to deliberately block humanitarian aid into Gaza. As stated by the Vice President of the European Commission, Joseph Borrell, Israel is provoking famine in Gaza and using starvation as a weapon of war. According to the IPC, 100% of people in Gaza are acutely food insecure. This is unprecedented. No IPC analysis has ever recorded such levels of food insecurity anywhere in the world. UNICEF says that babies in Gaza do not have the energy to cry anymore. We are already witnessing with horror the death of children due to starvation. The international community is no longer discussing whether the indiscriminate and disproportionate attacks and collective punishment by Israel in Gaza amounts to war crimes and crimes against humanity. But the International Court of Justice found it plausible that Israel's acts could amount to genocide and issued provisional measures to protect Palestinians. United Nations Special Rapporteur on Palestinian Territories, Francesca Albanese, analyzed the pattern of violence and Israel's policies in Gaza in her latest report and concluded that there are reasonable grounds to believe that the threshold indicating Israel's commission of genocide is met. One of the key findings of her report is that Israel's executive and military leadership issued statements of genocidal intent and intentionally distorted jus in bello principles, subverting their protective functions in an attempt to legitimize genocidal violence against the Palestinian people. We have all condemned the killing and kidnapping of Israeli civilians on 7th October. But it is unconscionable and a grave shame that there are still colleagues in this Assembly and governments in Council of Europe who refuse to acknowledge and condemn Israel's violations of international humanitarian law, which makes them complicit in these crimes. They should know that they have buried their legitimacy to speak about human rights ever again, together with the bodies of thousands of children murdered in Gaza. This Assembly and governments all around the world should avoid double standards and hold Israel, like all actors, accountable to international standards applied elsewhere. The report of Mr. Fassino on this conflict lacked any substantial content and is a disgrace to this Assembly's values. A new objective report making the necessary recommendations should urgently be prepared. We must all call for a permanent ceasefire, immediate and full implementation of all ICJ orders, unhindered humanitarian aid and cooperation with UN agencies, release of all hostages, 133 hostages held in Gaza, and thousands of Palestinians detained in Israeli prisons without due process, reinstating of funding for UNRWA, and seizing of all arms exports to Israel in order to uphold international law and prevent a region-wide conflict. Thank you.
Alfred Herr.
Yes, thank you very much, Mr. President. We have heard, I never heard such a lot of nonsense as in this debate. And to Mrs. Celik, I must tell you, the report of Mr. Fassino found a majority in this parliament. And if you are a Democrat, you should accept a democratic decision by the Council of Europe. But that shows your thinking. Probably you think like Hamas. They killed their Fatah brothers in Gaza and established a terrorist regime. And Gaza was not an open prison. The Israelis withdrew under Ariel Sharon, and they had the choice either to cooperate and make something out of this Gaza Strip, or to make terror, and they choose the terror. And I also want to remind you, there is a border with Egypt, with their Arabic brothers, which is closed as well. So don't blame Israel all the time for the situation in Gaza Strip. And what Hamas did, and what Hamas has in their constitution, kill every Jew wherever you find him. Not only in Israel, also in Brussels, also in Zurich, also in Paris. Wherever you see a Jew, you kill him. And you are supporting such a terrorist regime with what you were saying here. If you want to avoid a humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza, you tell Hamas to release the hostages. That's point one. Point two is we need to dismantle Hamas. That's the second point. And the third point is we need a caretaker government in Gaza that seeks peace also with Israel, that has a rule of law, and that has an education in the school system, not run by UNRWA, with school books that glorify martyrdom, so with school books that seek peace with their friends in Israel. And UNRWA is part of the problem. And you know exactly why are there so many civilian casualties. Where do they hide, those terrorists? They hide in schools, they hide in hospitals, and the IDF, they take the utmost care to avoid civilian casualties, but Hamas, they don't care. They don't care about Jews, they don't care about their Palestinian brothers, they don't care about Muslim brothers, they don't care about life at all. So you are Turkish, you are friends with your Hamas brothers, you speak to them to release the hostages, and then you are part of the solution and not part of the problem. Thank you.
Mr. Hare, it was a very interesting discussion we had until now. It is interesting to listen all the opinions, even we do not agree with them, but there's no need to insult any of our colleagues. And I would like to call all of you to address to the President and not to personally to our colleagues. You are free to express yourself, of course. So, dear colleagues, I have promised that we're going to finish the list, and everybody who is registered. Mrs. Celik cannot. I think that you are already covered with what I have said. If not, of course, I will give you the floor, but I think that we can give an end here. I had already comment on that. If you insist, I will give you the floor, but I think that we can give an end here. I have already commented on what has been said on behalf of the Assembly. So if you insist, I will give you the floor. Okay.
Mr. President, this is the second time Mr. Hare targeted me, and it's appalling that a member of this assembly would use hate speech against me for my ideas, and it's nothing more than an effort to whitewash the killing of thousands of civilians by the IDF. I have always condemned violence against all civilians, regardless of their ethnicity and religion, and I wish Mr. Hare could do the same instead of showcasing his double standards and anti-Muslim bias. Thank you.
Thank you. Dear colleagues, I remind you that at the end of a current affairs debate, the Assembly is not asked to decide upon a text, but the matter may be referred by the Bureau to the responsible committee for a report. The Assembly will hold its next public sitting tomorrow at 10:30 a.m. with the agenda which was approved on Monday. The sitting is adjourned.